Good evening, everyone. I'm Jane Cowell, Director of Regional Access and Public Libraries, and I'd like to welcome you to the State Library of Queensland for tonight's event. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Turrbal people, and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. The location of State Library on Queensland Point was historically a significant meeting place and gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal people, and we proudly continue that tradition today, and we have a lot of events here and that meeting of the minds as well as people. I'd also like to acknowledge and welcome Janette Wright, our CEO and State Librarian of the State Library of Queensland, Chris Saines, Director of the Queensland Art Gallery, Jenny Harper, the Director of the Christchurch Art Gallery, Jillian Marsh, the Director of Public Engagement for the Queensland Museum, Michelle Helmrich, the Associate Director of the UQ Art Museum, and Charlotte Davey, the President of the Australasian Registrars Committee, and members of the Australasian Registrars Committee Council who are here tonight. We are very pleased to present tonight's talk as part of the 2014 Australasian Registrars Committee Conference. The committee is dedicated to encouraging the professional development of members by providing forums such as this for exchanging ideas and expertise between registrars, collection managers and professionals in related fields in museums. And it's great that I see a number of library staff, museum staff and gallery staff here today, and some of that sharing is really valuable. It's fitting that this year's conference, titled Changing Spaces, is held here at the State Library of Queensland. Libraries, with their increasing emphasis on digital delivery of collections and services, are actually industry leaders in one of the changing spaces, which is a focus for this conference, that virtual museum space and digital storage and access to our cultural heritage. Tonight, we're privileged to be able to hear from some of the key leaders in this sector in Queensland as well as overseas. And just a little bit of housekeeping, if you do wish to leave the auditorium while the talk is on, could you please make your way to the back doors as the front ones are now locked? And also, if you do want to join in our Twitter conversation, the Twitter handle is behind me here and #FutureMuseums. I'd now like to welcome Michelle Helmrich to begin tonight's conversation.
Thank you, Jane. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we gather and pay my respects to elders past and present, and thank the organisers of the 2014 Australasian Registrars Committee Conference for initiating this event. This session, Future Directions for Museums, will showcase how key players in the Australasian GLAM sector of galleries, libraries, archives and museums forecast the challenges and opportunities for their sector, as well as future directions and trends. I should say that we are not quite GLAM, as we don't have anyone on the panel representing the archives, but we do have some terrific speakers nonetheless. Jenny Harper was appointed Director of the Christchurch Art Gallery to Puna Owai Fetu in 2006 and has since taken on the challenges posed by the 2010-11 Canterbury earthquakes. She has held senior academic and management positions in New Zealand. She was Director of the former National Art Gallery in Wellington, as well as Director of Art and History at the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongaroa. Jenny was Commissioner for the New Zealand exhibition at Venice Biennale in 2009 to 2013. In Brisbane, we know Jenny from when she was Curator of European Art at the Queensland Art Gallery in the mid-1980s. She is also presenting a keynote address at this conference. Jillian Marsh is Acting CEO and Director Public Engagement, Queensland Museum Network. She has worked across the museum sector in Australia and the United Kingdom. Prior to her recent appointment as Director Public Engagement at Queensland Museum Network in July 2013, Jillian held roles including Head of Marketing at both the British Museum and the National Gallery of London, and managed the exhibition's marketing and outreach programs at the Museum of Australian Democracy at Old Government House in Canberra. Her work has involved providing advice to museums in Europe, North America, Africa and Asia. Her current role at the Queensland Museum includes managing visitor services, marketing, media relations, 2D and 3D design, audience research and exhibitions. Chris Saines returned to the Queensland Art Gallery to take up the position of Director in May 2013. Chris formerly held the position of educator and later senior manager of curatorial programs at the Queensland Art Gallery. Probably, were you at the same?
We were.
We were at the same time. Prior to his current position, Chris was appointed in 1996 as director of the Auckland Art Gallery, Toi Otamaki, and led the gallery through a multi-million-dollar building restoration and expansion project that opened to the public in 2011. Earlier in his career, Chris was curator at the McClelland Gallery, a state regional gallery in Victoria. And Janette Wright, on our far furthest panellist, commenced in the role of Chief Executive Officer and State Librarian, State Library of Queensland in February 2012. The Library Board of Queensland Chairman, Professor Rolly Sussex, announced Janette as a new technology innovator with a strong commitment to the future of libraries to support social change and equity. Prior to her appointment, Ms. Wright was employed as CEO of Kaval Limited, a library services company, and RMIT Publishing, which equipped her with knowledge of the methods and techniques to digitise legacy collections. Janette's experience in public libraries, including time as Director of Public Library and Network Services at the State Library in New South Wales, has strengthened her commitment to increasing access to library services. And I'm going to ask you to please welcome our speakers for this evening. If you could join me in welcoming them. Now, some of the themes and questions that I hope we'll be traversing tonight include the digital arena, community and access, storage and ways of measuring success, amongst others. And there will be an opportunity to take questions towards the end. Perhaps we could just start with a more general question. What are some of the biggest changes you've seen across the sector in recent years? Maybe Chris.
Thanks, Michelle. The biggest changes probably would be the interaction with digital and specifically social media. I think, for instance, of the current exhibition we have on at Quagoma and the way that virtually every visitor engages not just with their eyes and their senses with that exhibit, but also engages with their smartphone and uploads it to Facebook and talks about it on Twitter and all these kind of things. This kind of sharing, if you like, of the experience with a wider community who are not in the space. And we always have these things that you can go into museums and have been able to for 15 or more years, where you can interact with tablets or screens that are, give you online access to further information about works. Now we're getting into scan coding, uploading some interview with an artist or whatever it might be. And I just think the fluidity with which people are receiving information beyond the more conventional forms is it's just one of many of those perhaps key changes I would have observed.
Jenny, earlier when we were chatting, you mentioned how museums were places of research and so on, which they still are, but perhaps there is also different ways of engaging with our audiences and reaching them.
After your introduction, Michelle, just one of the changes that has struck me is that I was, I think, the first and last curator of European art at the Queensland Art Gallery. And of course, Queensland has really led the way in looking at the rest of the world. So I think in my field, certainly, the change from thinking of Europe as the centre of all things great has really, really transformed the way that what we've showed and to whom we've showed it over the last 30 years. Probably a slightly more old-fashioned response than yours. But also, I was reflecting on the fact that 30 years ago, say, when Chris and I were working together in Queensland in different roles, we were pretty at ease, the museum profession, gallery profession, very at ease with being part of the education and scholarly enterprise. I think that's where we placed ourselves. We contributed to scholarship, and we were there primarily for the education of people but children, and that was where we belonged. over the time, over quite a few years, I think we're much more at ease in being in the leisure sector and being part of the tourist sector. We're much more at ease with being one of the ways that people, one of the offerings that people take up when they come to our cities. It's a wee bit problematic for us in Christchurch with being closed, but I can tell you more about that tomorrow and how we've changed that. I think also, if I might be allowed 3 comments, there's been a big change in New Zealand in the sense of ownership of collections. I think 30 years ago we felt we owned our collections in a very particular way and curators were responsible for them and they were accessioned and that was that. In New Zealand anyway, there is a much more of a shared sense of stewardship, and particularly with Maori material of Maori origin. Many times you need to request permission to borrow works from the tribal group. You're much more conscious of their ownership and the fact that ownership of material is shared, and it's not entirely the responsibility of the museum which has accessioned the work. So I think that's a very interesting move as well, and I'm not sure how that's paralleled here.
Is that something you'd like to comment on, or more generally?
Certainly, there's a couple of things I'd like to say. One is that as a state library, the role of the state libraries has been quite long-standing in collecting and preserving the documentary heritage of the state or the relevant jurisdiction. And I think the thing that I've noticed, certainly with Queensland especially leading the way, is that we've taken on board the need to capture and preserve the oral traditions, so the Indigenous histories, even the ones that are not written down, and trying to capture those, whether they're digital stories or oral histories or other ways of capturing the whole story of Queensland as a state. And that's a big shift in what's happened with state libraries, I think right across Australia and New Zealand, but certainly there's been a leadership role here in Queensland. But in terms of my first reaction to your question, Michelle, it was along the lines of libraries have not really changed their mission in terms of what we offer communities, and that is ways of accessing knowledge or even creating and building knowledge. But the thing is, our methods have changed dramatically. And whereas 25 years ago you would have thought that a library was a passive receiver of the output of the publishing industry, and so the publishers were seen as the people who went out and commissioned new material and edited it and created and distributed it, and the libraries were passively receiving the output of the publishing industry. That's completely turned on its head now, and libraries are active participants all the way up the value chain, so that we are engaged with people in commissioning content and editing and shaping that content for people now. And the other big challenge for us has been that we have to do that in the digital space now. And when I bring people around the library and I show them that we have the documentary heritage collections that are original materials, diaries, papers, maps, pictures, all sorts of materials that you'd expect to find in a library with a documentary heritage responsibility. But we need to take account of not only how we digitise that to make it available for people who can't come here to Brisbane, but how do we find the preservation pathway to make sure it's still accessible in 25 years or 50 years' time, or if you think how long you can store books, 500 years' time. So we've got that task, plus we also have to now make sure that we're capturing the knowledge that's being created that's born digital. And so we're less about the physical objects and more about the content. So we have a content strategy rather than a collection management policy.
Jillian, if we just go back to that first question so that you can contribute on this also, just in terms of your international experience and Australian experience, how do you see some of the new trends emerging?
I think what's been a continual increasing trend globally is the increasing pressure to generate more and more revenue for museums and galleries in particular to become more viable and taking ownership of their destiny in a different way, which kind of creates some competing tensions about preserving collections and creating the best possible learning outcomes from visitor experiences with actually having to generate mass popular appeal and money, which is, it's interesting, and it creates a whole lot of opportunities that I think are fantastic and wonderful, but also kind of keeps forcing everyone to think about why we're doing certain activity. And I think that's changing, and the pressure on that is continual and growing. What I think is wonderful from an exhibition perspective is just to see how we're getting more and more sophisticated with our storytelling techniques, and how museums and galleries are taking on more and more of the lessons from probably sectors like film and theatre to create atmosphere and lighting and immersive experiences that kind of enhance people's connection with an object and the story that's being told, which I think is a wonderful development. It's certainly a great departure from how things were even 10 years ago. I just recently have been in London, and I managed to catch one of the exhibitions at the British Museum where I used to work. And it was a wonderful exhibition, Beyond El Dorado. And I don't know if any of you caught it, but in very small exhibition space, the team managed to create this kind of wonderful kind of atmosphere through lighting and sound that really enhanced the experience. And I think that's one of those positive moves that we keep evolving and learning and growing. And I think that's what I'm seeing across the sector, just that need to keep enhancing the offer and the experience, but always remembering that important connection with the object, whether it be in person or what you kind of, the enhancement you get online when you have that connection, but all about the object, which I think is a nice thing to see has been the steady stream.
Chris, I was going to ask you, does the new generation of visitors bring different expectations? For instance, in the visual arts, the contemporary art appears to be challenging the traditional notion of the blockbuster. If you look at recent exhibitions across Australia, the Sydney Biennale, the Adelaide Biennial, the recent Melbourne Now and NGV, and Saiguochang in here, how are you seeing things changing in that respect?
Well, I think the way both that museums produce exhibitions and the public consume them is quite different. And although I felt like my first response seems in contrast now like a haiku, as there were other more complex patterns woven by all of the other three panellists, one of the thoughts that Jenny struck in my mind, which synchronises with your question, is that as an educator, Jenny was a curator at the gallery, I was working in my earlier days here as an educator, we really believed our job was to inform the public in the most objective, but in a sense passionate way that we could, to create this sense of exchange between the meaning of the artwork and the experience of the visitor. Well, if we still think that, we're probably out of a job, because the public don't want that now. Some members of the public do, and we all know when you come along to a floor talk with a charismatic artist speaker or curator or whatever, there is nothing so electrifying in terms of opening up the synapses to what the work might be about. But in the end, people want to be the curators of their own museum experiences now. They want to find other ways in. And our job, I think, as art museums, through the agency of all these big shows and so on that you're talking about, is to provide that thing called agency to them, to give them all that they need to get there themselves, rather than taking them there and see, aha, I'm really clever, I told you, isn't it amazing? Which is maybe what I spent years of my life doing. And I can remember coming out of exhibition tours thinking, well, that went well. And in a way, you don't do it that way now. You don't teach that way now. It's less didactic, more experiential. You're trying to open up ideas and open up thinking and arouse curiosity without necessarily ladling on heavy doses of information and content that's going to enable people to go, oh, now I get it, Having just recently trekked around Melbourne Now and obviously, the Biennale of Sydney and other sorts of shows on that scale, as an art consumer, you're being presented with ever more spectacularly scaled, ambitious exhibits, and the one in our building at the moment, never more so in a way, even for this institution. But these things, if we just consume them quickly as spectacle and don't find ways of slowing our audience's consumption down, we'll find we're doing more and more with less and less attention span being given to it. And that's one of the reasons. I learned this from Sai in some ways when he put the tea pavilion in at the end of that show, and the video and the tasting of the tea. The whole rationale for that was they've seen these other works, they've taken them in, they've been amazed by them and interested in them and what they might mean. Now they have to stop and perhaps reflect on that, reflect on the deeper history of where this work emerges from, and so on and so on. And I think he's right. I think we've got to, in these big exhibitions, we've got to create those moments where we're causing people to almost actively reflect on the things that they've just been immersed in, or people will find it's not enough, it's not enough, it's not enough, and their attention spans will, weary too quickly.
Can I just come in about attention spans? Because I've spent 4 or 5 days in Sydney before coming here, so I've seen the Sydney Biennale as much as I could consume in 4 days, 4 whole days. 5 sites. I went to 2 on one day, but otherwise I went to a full venue per day. And I found myself really videoed out, and I couldn't watch another one. And it's great for collecting because, you don't take much storage. Yes. But I found myself, even though I'd given myself 4 days to look at this exhibition, as if I hadn't yet really seen it. And I think that's a problem. Yeah. Whereas coming here to Queensland this afternoon, I consumed the exhibition in Goma. I can't pronounce his name. I'm sorry, I haven't heard it often enough. Yeah. I consumed that in a much shorter time. I was really impressed with the staging of it, obviously, and I will go back. But that was, I was able to see that quite simply, to take it in 3/4 of an hour, yeah. Whereas 4 days of the Biennale. So I think it's quite, that's a completely different experience to the ones we put on normally, isn't it? You can't expect people to spend that sort of time in your institution, let alone consuming a single exhibition in a city, I don't think.
Talking about how you can easily store video, you can probably easily tour video.
Yes, it's trite.
It certainly isn't probably such a problem for some of the registrars as touring other things.
You can post a video to someone, you don't even have to insure it. It's a cheap, it's a cheap
Hang on,
way.
it's a registrar's conference.
Let's not get too excited about the digital stuff. We've got to worry about how we can access it in 25 years' time.
Yes, true.
Yes, of course.
Is an exhibition space defined by the physical space? For instance, in the retail sector, much has been said about the competition between bricks and mortar retail outlets and online selling. For galleries, museums and libraries, are online options challenging the supremacy of bricks and mortar edifices? And maybe this is something that you might like to consider, but also, Jenny, I don't want you to start revealing what you're going to tell us tomorrow in your paper.
Well, I'm happy to comment on that. I think the analogy with retail is not the same, because that's a much more transactional based exchange, and I don't think that's what libraries, at least that's not what we offer. And I think that we believe, and all the evidence suggests that our clients, our consumers believe this too, that we need to have both physical and virtual spaces, and that some of the feedback we get from younger clients is that when they're on our website, they think they're at the library. And, and there's a whole generation of the world that think that when they're in a place virtually, they're in that place. So I think there's a need for us to be present and engaging in both physical and virtual spaces for different reasons, for different people, and probably across different generations. But certainly, I'm sure Jane would back me up on this. There's kids who've said things like, but I'm in the library, when all they mean is that they're actually in the library space online.
That's a good thing to say.
Are there shared trends across the sector towards digital content and more emphasis on digital spaces to tell stories? Maybe this is one for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a growing kind of pressure to get more of our collections online, and I think that's a good thing. We want, in terms of access for all, tick. Where I think the tension is sometimes people tend to not celebrate the object. When we have an opportunity to present it in a physical space, I think sometimes there is a temptation to overlay the interpretation on touchscreens and forms of technology in front of the object and not actually celebrate it in its own right. And I think it's not quite asking the same thing, but there's almost that kind of thing we have to remember, that if you have too much content delivered in that way, well, how is that different from delivering on the website as opposed to what you can get from that access to an object? And when we were talking about curating your own experience, and I think also levels of interpretation, people want to know the story behind an object, but they also want to find their own meaning sometimes too. And you can overlay with that. There are also some tensions, I think, in terms of what we can afford. As museums and galleries, I think sometimes we overinvest. We get very excited about technology that comes along, and perhaps that's not sustainable in the physical space, which again is why it's great if we can provide more content that people can visit online after their visit, after they've had access to the object. But just kind of getting that balance right, I think, is an ongoing kind of tension. And I think there was probably a phase where a lot of institutions went gangbusters and thought we had to invest lots of money in handheld devices and touchscreens and all the rest of it. And I think everyone, well, most people are starting to step back now and think about what's sustainable, what adds value, and that's different, I think.
Michelle, I was looking at a list of artists today for a show that we're about to do, and I'm clearly now a senior. So from that perspective of a senior, I came into the museum industry at a time when we were about the authenticity of the object, and whether it's the art object or the museum object or the rare book or whatever it was, we were all about that. And that was in a way our training, and that was what we were committed to protecting and preserving and to interpreting and communicating in the best possible way to our audiences. And I think that now when I look at the refresh we've just done of the gallery's strategic plan, right up there in the top in the sort of mission component of it, we've added on-site and online. And they are, in fact, the two worlds in which the art object and the art experiences really of museums globally now inhabit both those spaces. We don't really inhabit our virtual space or our online space anywhere near as well as we inhabit our physical space right now. That's a work in progress. And here I give pause and praise to what they've done in Christchurch, because one of the upsides, and you need everyone you can get in the situation that Christchurch and Jenny and her team have been in, is that they've put a tremendous amount of work into almost backstories like management of collection procedures and online. And some of the new things like linking up Google Earth with, for instance, there's a very famous painting in the collection by Rita Angus, possibly the most loved painting in New Zealand. I wish we had it in Auckland when I worked there. And it's called Cass. It's a beautiful little thing.
I'm going to show you a slide.
Oh, there we are.
Tomorrow.
I've given you a boost. And in that particular, you go in online on the Christchurch website, and Cass is in fact a real railway station in a real place in New Zealand. And immediately you're given that option to literally Google Earth the station that Rita Angus painted. I mean, it's fantastic. And it was the first museum I'd seen do something like that online. And I think that when you go around, as many of our teams do, and look at websites around the world, the way in which they're now functioning, creating almost, as Google Art does, a kind of virtual interaction with museum spaces physically as you go through and explore and discover new work. In Auckland, we populated the Google Art Project with some material. I know that Sydney and Canberra did. I don't think Queensland did, but we should. And I look at those things and I think, right, that's one thing. Then there's the experience of a performance artist like Maria Abramovich at MoMA, with tens of thousands of people over months queuing up to meet an artist and talk to them and ask them about their practice. So if ever you needed proof positive that people are still interested in not just in the object but in the practitioner who makes the object, I thought that that event was a great example. And more than that, there's the immersive kind of experiential experiences that people hunger for these days, particularly within art museum settings. And you can't do that online. Well, you will be able to. You'll put the goggles on one day and you'll wear the Google glasses into the gallery, and all of those other things will undoubtedly happen. Virtual worlds can be introduced around physical objects. But I do think that this confluence of the on-site and the online is really, that is a space in which we truly are stepping out into the future museum.
I was going to ask you, Janette, whether the library is still the museum of the book.
Oh, well, that's one of my favourite topics. I think whilst the core mission of the library is not a museum for objects and therefore not a museum for things, but I certainly think that traditionally libraries and librarians have become the experts in relation to books. And so we've kind of inherited this museum of the book role, and this is book as artefact rather than book as carrier of its content. And in fact, State Library of Queensland has the best collection of artist books in Australia. And these are definitely book as artefact. And I've pondered on what the interest is in artists making books. And it seems to me there's a couple of good reasons why artists make books. One is that they like that physicality of the turning the leaves of the pages of the book, and they want to make something like that, like a sculpture. And that's an object which we can also create a digital version of and make that experience available to people. But I think probably the more important reason for artist books is the idea that books have carried our knowledge, our civilization for hundreds of years, for longer than that. And we therefore regard books as something spiritual. And so I think artists make artist books in an attempt to create something spiritual, as they do with other artworks. And I would not want us to lose that role of being the museum for the book. But on the other hand, I think there are so many other things that we have to do that it isn't our primary role, and it helps us engage with wider communities, and particularly with the philanthropy communities and with people who have this idea about the spirituality of the book. But really, it's just something we've inherited, and primarily our role is in the knowledge space. And I think probably the museum would say the same.
Yeah, knowledge generation.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's true for all of us, isn't it, really? That we've all got a different slant on knowledge and on the sort of encouragement of future knowledge and information building. But yes, we're in this odd position of having been forced in a way into the digital space because we have a closed building still 3 years on after a major event, which didn't seem so bad for us at the beginning, but became worse as the ground settled differently, literally, under us. But luckily we had built a digital platform because we didn't have to do that work right from scratch. I'm very, very grateful that we'd already branched into that way of doing things. I mean, it's been great, it's been fantastic. We have people selecting exhibitions online in a My Gallery space, and we publish those, and we learn new things about our collection all the time. But I can't wait for us to open and to see it again. And I think there'll be a huge celebration in Christchurch when we get that collection out and are able to show things again. We had this amusing incident, not really incident, but we used to have some art bites, they were called, and guides, volunteer guides, were trained up and took people for just a 20-minute chat about a work in front of a painting during lunchtime usually, so hence the word art bites. And one of them, an enthusiastic one, has just restituted this with life-sized photographs of works from the collection. So now people can go to one of our offsite spaces and they're shown a big photograph and he talks as if it's the work. But it doesn't stand in for it, but I suppose it does. It helps people get over the pain of actually not seeing things that they've grown to love. And yes, that's...
But back to the libraries. I mean, libraries are known to be divesting themselves of books. Where we are at the UQ in the Art Museum, we're right beside the Biological Sciences Library, and that is a library without any books, and there are students in there 24/7. And I'm just wondering, are there areas where you will be digitising to free up the shelves?
We have the task of digitising the legacy collections, the legal deposit items and the published works that are related to the documentary heritage of Queensland. And because we want to make them available to people who can't come here to South Bank, we want to digitise them and make them available. But also because we see that that is another way of exposing them, and we've been well and truly involved in open data movements in Queensland, putting a lot of the files and the pictures and so on up online so that people can reuse them. But also we have the need to capture the documentary heritage of today for the future, and most of that is born digital. And so we need to be capturing websites and blogs and other things. And the biggest issue for us in capturing and preserving either what we call turned digital or born digital content, both groups, is that preservation pathway. And certainly for documentary heritage, that's our mission. It's very clear we need to make that available, and we need to invest in the preservation infrastructure. But when it comes to providing information services to people who live in Queensland, which is another major role of the State Library, we actually are doing most of that online now. 85% of the inquiries are being handled online, and we do that not through using what used to be the State Reference Library collection of books in the reading rooms or in the stack or in the repository, but actually by using materials that are available online. We pay annual subscriptions for databases for everyone resident in Queensland. And so I bring people into the library and I take them on a tour and I talk about the documentary heritage collection and how we keep the original materials and digitise them. But I also take them into the reading room and the repositories and I say, we are going to discard these materials, most of them. And some people are quite shocked by that idea, but I then can point out that most of those materials were either published in New York or London or somewhere else in the world, and so there will be a hard copy somewhere else. They've been published in the past and they're not needed here now for us to deliver an information service. And they'll either be available free online or they'll be behind a paywall that we will pay for, just like the subscriptions. So I anticipate, certainly in my time here, that we will somehow let go of all of those collections in what used to be the State Reference Library.
I was going to say, we're probably not going to pursue the same deaccession policy at the gallery.
That's why we don't have such an urgent storage problem.
Indeed.
Yes, well, storage is obviously a problem, and are there considerations of shared storage or open storage, allowing public access?
Well, three of the collecting institutions on the South Bank are pursuing that with Arts Queensland at the moment. We're looking in time to establish an off-site store, and in the interim we're looking for some temporary, make good measures to try and get us through for a few more years. But I think the government's very receptive to that. But I think the broader problem for getting all the local stuff is that when you're in a collection-based institution, you are inevitably and invariably going to increase the scale of what you collect and thus complicate
You have
just
acquired 99
Indeed we have.
yes. Life-size animals.
Yes,
so.
we're calling the mezzanine that we're installing up in our new quag extension to the storage Noah's Ark, because it will be an extraordinary place compared to what we conventionally store up there. But the thing is that, yes, it's the variety, it's the digital media that we also have to look after. It's photographic and negative-based materials. It's ephemeral artworks, which everyone in the room would know that works in the art museum setting, that many artists are giving you work these days, or you're procuring it and acquiring it, in mediums that we've hitherto never had to deal with, and you don't necessarily understand the physical integrity or stability of some of those materials. I remember we acquired a work in Auckland, and this will, my colleagues up in the middle will remember this. We acquired a work which actually melted. It was, I won't name the artist, based in Melbourne, and it was a series of things that were kind of plastic meets rosin meets something, and we opened up the box when we moved from the temporary store back into the building, and they'd all kind of collapsed. They literally appeared to melt. So we had to basically go back to the artist, and he remade the work. But it's just an example of the kind of difficulties that we all face now. Fugitive colours within works on paper, all these kind of things are just part of the, and storing these guys, it's just kind of part of the new world. And if we all had paper collections and just had to add Solander boxes, we'd be feeling really relaxed. But once we start buying objects of the kind of complexity that contemporary artists are generating, because they're increasingly working with installation or three-dimensionally based media rather than two-dimensionally based, and that's going to invariably create problems. And we'll get pushbacks, let me assure you, from government, as we all have in these jobs. How many times have we fronted councils or parliaments and been told, well, you'll just have to stop collecting? Well, let's speak to the parks people about the grass stopping growing, because in the end, it is simply in the nature of collecting institutions, of our kind at least, that you do keep growing, not necessarily exponentially and not necessarily without good, clear policy guidance to that development, but we're going to get bigger. Give it 10 years, we'll be bigger than we were in the last 10. Yeah.
And in the museum sector, you have important research collections and even collections of living things.
We do. The diversity of the collections presents some real challenges. I mean, in the Queensland Museum collection, we have everything from a 30-tonne tank to many, many bugs. It's extraordinary, and the diversity in our cultural environments and natural environments collections presents a number of challenges. Obviously, the needs for conservation are very different, like depending on the objects. We would like to get as much of our collection on display as possible, but we're still talking about over 1 million items in the Queensland Museum collection, and we are adding thousands of items to our collection every year. So yes, it's something we can't stop doing. Certainly Queensland Story keeps kind of growing and changing, and we keep collecting with it. But some of the work from the natural environments team, I mean, that's definitely ongoing. I think some of the stuff that we do that people don't realise is our active kind of research, even from a identifying new species point of view. In 2013, I think our scientists identified over 200 new species. There's amazing diversity in what we do and the collections that are associated with that.
Before we go to question, I'd just like to maybe get you to comment on how all your institutions, or how you are thinking in the future and at present of working with communities. Is there a difference in how you are engaging with communities?
Well, we certainly have over the last, when I say we, I mean libraries generally in Australia, over the last 20 years have begun and really well-established public exhibition programs. I worked at the State Library of New South Wales in the 90s, and we were really the first of the libraries in the country to start to exhibit and show items from the collections. And that was a very positive move because it engaged more people and people could see what was in the collections, and that hadn't typically been the way libraries worked. And now all of the libraries do that, and I think we've probably now hit the point where we've got the most benefit from that, and we are moving now from providing shows for the community through the stage of working with communities to now letting communities actually do their own curation and exhibitions. So that's a big shift for us.
We haven't gone to that extent. Some art museums do. They create community spaces. That's not something we're currently envisaging, although I could imagine in the online space a great deal of that kind of work could be done. But I'm not unsympathetic to the idea of a community-based gallery in an art museum collection-based setting. I think these things are not mutually inconsistent, and some museums have done it very well. I'm interested more in the way in which the community that we currently host at the gallery, not just at Quag but at Goma, the way that we can do even more to engage with and empower that audience to have their own experiences, that they can bring the things that already they know to the gallery, and that we can open up the possibilities of art for them. And I think that the thing is that we might have historically done that, as I alluded to earlier, in a more didactic manner, and now it's a more open system manner, with all sorts of points of access that we make available to our audiences. And we often talk, as many art museums do, about being sort of artist-directed. The SCI exhibition's a really good example of that. We were quite artist-directed with that one. So artist-directed and audience-directed. Mm-hmm. You know, I think there's a real sense that we want our audiences to take ownership of these experiences. We don't want to be the people that are just, in a sense, delivering them in a way that we expect certain outcomes. We should be constantly surprised in the way in which people both engage with and respond to the things that we do. And the space I'd hope that we're working more and more in is that kind of space. And a friend of mine from Tate Modern, who was over talking to a group of us a few months ago, she did use that word beautifully when she talked about, and I've said it I think earlier today, the agency, giving people agency to literally have their own experiences on their own terms without you necessarily giving them all that they need for that experience to be meaningful. And I think that's what they're trying to do in their learning programs at Tate, and I would hope that that's a high shelf goal that we can be aspiring to here as well.
And I think that one of the key measures of our success is the engagement of the audience and the sort of sense of agency that you bring into a community. It's not like, particularly in the contemporary art field, you can necessarily go to your community and ask them who they'd like to see, because you know they'll say Impressionism or Monet or something like that, and they won't ever have heard of Ron Muick, who I know showed here and showed with amazing results in Christchurch. Yeah. Just amazing results, neatly sandwiched between earthquakes. We got 135,000 people, and 60% of them were Christchurch residents, and 33% of that 60% had never been to the gallery before. Now that's engaging your community, and that's a huge measure of success. And, you know, I bandy these figures around all the time because it's they just roll off your tongue, and it's a great, you know, everyone can understand what you're talking about. It's like telling the councils or the governments that grass doesn't stop growing and we don't stop collecting. We don't. Anyway.
Did you have any quick comments? Because otherwise I'll open up for get some questions.
The only thing I would say that obviously in the museum environment where we're very engaged with communities on a number of levels, we even borrow objects from communities, and we did that recently for an exhibition, Collectomania. And I think what I love about the opportunity for growth of that relationship at Queensland Museum is that we're seen as that trusted source of information. And just by the nature of the kind of inquiries that our team gets on the 7 day a week information line, and the kind of things that people bring in and ask our teams about, I mean, I love that. I love that there's already that kind of trusted relationship, and I can see that can only grow and strengthen over the years to follow. Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions? We have a mic, I believe. Yes, there's one here and one right up at the back.
Just a quick question for Jenny Harper. As the gallery hasn't been open for 3 years, have you been able to continue to collect?
Yes. But we've got a new council, and there are a couple of people on that council who wonder why a gallery needs to collect while it's closed, and are all for cutting that part of our budget. But no, that's one thing we've carried on with. Of course. Yes. And so we can't, in fact, we've bought about 400 works.
Could I
since
just
we've been
comment on
closed.
that? I mean, I know the question was about really how you're coping with the fact that you're closed, but the fact is that State Library of Queensland acquires, particularly in the documentary heritage Queensland content, 85% of our acquisitions are coming to us either as legal deposit or as donations now. So we're not, it's exactly as you say, Chris, photographers whose whole life work is now being donated to us as a collection. It's this kind of material which is Queensland's story, but it's coming to us now, and we're not having to go out. We don't need an acquisition budget so much, although there are special things we buy. But the collecting side is continuing at a pace.
And quite a few of our recent accessions have been donated works as well. So,
Yes. Can we go to the question at the top?
My question is for the panel. Can you hear that? Okay. The three objectives that I could hear coming out of the panel were knowledge creation or knowledge generation, engagement and experience, the key pillars or the destinations that the organizations are looking for. My question is, does the route matter? Is it physical or digital? As long as we achieve the destination, those are the 3 points.
Can I answer that? I don't know that I can answer it, but respond to it. I think it does matter, actually. And I feel that, if I wanted to abrogate the responsibility for collecting, caring for collections, housing and holding collections, and entirely invest our efforts and energies into the online or, virtual museum space, call it what you will. And those things do exist in the world now, and the one I mentioned, Google Art's a great example. It stitches together some of the greatest collections in the world. It even gives you the ability to interrogate them with Zoomify that would honestly, catch the eyebrow of a butterfly. They can go up so close with some of the technology that is used to capture these in high res these days. The thing is, I don't want my children to grow up in a world where that's the only world they inhabit. I want them to get off the bloody couch, make an effort to go into a city, a gallery, a town, a museum, and I want them to really believe that matters because they're doing it in a social setting. We haven't even talked about the social space of museums, the up-lates we run, those sorts of things that many museums run. It's about bringing people together around the art object, the fossil, the book, whatever it is, and that in itself imbues and fosters conversation, it fosters understanding and awareness. And I'm sorry, but I look too much at my own young children sitting on that bloody iPad, and I think, luckily I've got a couple that have been pretty well schooled in the business of visiting art museums, but you know what I mean. It doesn't matter about that. It's important, I think, that we recognise that we're dealing with things made by people, artists, under particular pressures to solve a particular problem or talk about a particular idea, communicate something in a way that is almost incommunicable without the making of that work, all of these things. And just because they make it, then I put it digitally up online. To me, that's just part of the story. It represents what exists in the gallery, but it isn't what exists in the gallery. And every time we hang a painting, we put a different one next to it anyway. So these fields of view in which the work is being set and contextualised are constantly shifting, and therefore the meaning of the work is constantly shifting. And again, if all I've got is that, couple of gig representing this thing on a screen, I'm not getting enough personally. I feel we need all these things if we're going to be the kind of rich and ultimately fulfilled and learning society we should be.
And I think it's also important not just to stop with the idea, but to, and I think probably some of my frustration with the Sydney Biennale and so much video work was I was just longing for something to be fabricated and to see something made and that I could experience in a space, and it just that's something that you get with a real object of whatever.
Could I comment on that? I agree with you, Chris, that we need to have both. We need to have the physical objects. And I certainly take Prashant's point, his question. I'm sure it was a devil's advocate role. But certainly I agree, we need to be doing both. And I sometimes talk about the public library as a park for the mind. You can go there and you can either play on your own or play with other people or connect with other people or connect with things or play games. Yeah. And that can be in a virtual park or it can be in a physical park. But they are different experiences and you'd want to have both of them. And I wouldn't want us to only ever live in a virtual world. No. But both of you talked about the idea of making things, and one of the traditions that have been recently developed in public libraries is the makerspace. And makerspaces are springing up all over the world in libraries, as well as in other places. And of course the State Library has one here at the Edge. And it's on its way to being what you call a fab lab or a fabrication laboratory, which is what MIT set up with some standards for. You need to have certain equipment, you need to have a 3D printer, you need to have a laser cutter, you need to have some stitching machines and so on. Now we don't have all of that, but we're still listed as a fab lab. But it was just you, Jenny, talking about the idea of actually physically making things that reminded me that libraries can be those sort of places. I think galleries and museums can too. Yeah. Yes. They're places where people can embody an idea and then physically make it.
And look at the children's space in the Queensland Art Gallery. They're terrific spaces where things can be made and remade and looked at and taken home. And
Sounds like an ab-fab lab. Sorry. I know others were thinking it.
I'm actually thinking I might be getting a signal that we've run out of time.
Something.
But I would like everyone to thank our speakers this evening, Jillian Marsh, Jenny Harper, Chris Saines and Janette Wright.
We're happy to carry on the conversation over a drink.
Thank you. And for those who'd like to revisit the conversation or share it with friends or colleagues, the webcast will be available on the SLQ website within a week, so you can actually share it around. I'd now like to invite Charlotte Davey, President of the ARC, to make some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks to the panel tonight. I feel really delighted, I think, with the conversation tonight, because in designing the conference that we're about to head into in the next few days, I'd really been thinking a lot about the anxiety of change. And I think tonight you've really given us a huge amount of reassurance about the direction that we're heading. And I'm just so glad we're in safe hands. So thank you very much to Janette for hosting us tonight and for the conference hosting in the next few days. And to all of you individually, thank you very much for your insight, for your leadership and for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.